Great. So thank you for that. You're welcome to continue typing in the flip chart paper as we go along. We thought that now we might just begin and continue with a moment of prayer. We recognize that during this webinar there will be a lot of words that will be shared, and so we thought we would our prayer time might be a silent one where we would invite one another into silent reflection and silent prayer, and we'll close the prayer with an amen. So let us have a time of silent prayer together. Let us pray. And may all God's people say amen.
Amen.
Amen. So welcome once again. The format for this evening's webinar will be a conversational one between myself and Tom. Tom will share much of his wisdom around theologies of disabilities. So we have some questions that will engage with one another, and you're welcome to continue to use the flip chart paper. If you also have questions that you would love for Tom to answer, please feel free to write those into the flip chart paper. So Tom, we had a very brief introduction of you earlier, just noting that you work at Emmanuel College as Vice Principal and Associate Professor of Theology. But I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about you and who you are and what you do.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you. I'm grateful to be here with you, all online, and I want to recognize that we're all bodies. And the significance of the territorial acknowledgement is the fact that we're all related to the territories, to each other as bodies. And a lot of the conversation tonight will be about bodies. And so as I introduce myself, I'm mindful that here we are online in a unique format as well, but connected. And so I hope this is a conversation that we can have together and really enrich and draw from the wisdom in this room together, even though we're online. I teach at the University of Toronto, Emmanuel College, and I know some of you actually, so it's really neat to see and recognize some of you out there. I've been teaching at Emmanuel now for, it's hard to believe, 11 years, and I came from Wisconsin in the States where I was teaching, and one of the things that drew me to Toronto was the healthcare in Canada. In particular, because as some of you know, my oldest son is diagnosed on the autism spectrum, and it was really important to find good resources for my son. And Toronto's been a fabulous place for that. And I love teaching at Emmanuel and getting to know students in a variety of ways. So I come at this issue of teaching theology and being involved in theological education for very personal reasons. And I'm committed to the work of transformation that theological education involves. So that's a little bit about me. I'm sure we'll talk a little more and get a little more detailed. But
Oh, that's great, Tom. Thanks for sharing both personal and professional experiences. We really appreciate that, so thank you. So this evening our topic is theologies of disabilities. So I wonder if we can break that down a little bit. You're a professor of theology. Can you talk a little bit about what does theology mean?
Sure, in 5 quick sentences. No, theology is one of those scary words that people think, oh, that's for professors to do in the abstract ivory tower. And one of the most important things about theology is it's about everybody's faith, which naturally seeks understanding. So I think of theology as faith-seeking understanding, the lives of faith that we live together in community that are embedded in the world of relationships and structures, some of them harmful. So theology is about understanding what it means to live a life of faith in a particular place and time with others, and understand more deeply what it means to affirm that God is love, that human beings are created in the image of God. All of this, of course, relates to the theme that we're talking about today. But if in a way all of us are already theologians, it's sort of our own responsibility to take ownership of what it is we believe, because that affects how we behave and practice in the world, and our practices in turn affect how we then think theologically. So faith-seeking understanding, but I see that as very much embedded in practices and not just an academic matter.
Wonderful. So thank you for sharing about faith, thinking, understanding, and reminding us that we're all theologians in some ways. So the other half of our topic, so we're talking theologies of disability. So we've talked a bit about what does theology mean, but what about disability? How would you describe what disability means?
Well, disability is a very complex and broad category, and there's a lot of debate about disability and what it means. But first of all, if we think of ourselves as bodies, disability relates to how bodies navigate space and time and relationships. There are some bodies that press against the world and the world presses against, that cause restrictions and limitations to movements, to participation in community. And so broadly conceived, disability involves impairments, some of which are related to social circumstances where people don't access what might involve flourishing together, where people don't have the conditions for action in ways that bring happiness and livelihood. So you can see already that disability is not so much just about an individual, but about social relationships related to movements, related to senses and action. Disabilities can be visible, can be invisible, and can relate to mental health, to medical challenges, to dementia, cognitive abilities. So it's a broad range of things, but often the word impairment is involved, and often the word participation and access to participation in navigating social life together. So you can see it's very complicated, and it's not an easy thing to talk about, and there are a variety of definitions that we could perhaps get into even together tonight. But most often it's related to impairments and how people navigate social space. So I, in my teaching, think of disability as a relational category, defined in relationships in certain contexts and spaces. I can go on to give examples about, in some cases, how wearing glasses makes my visual impairment not a disability because it's correctable. I'm legally blind, but in a context where glasses are available, it's not seen as a disability, whereas using a wheelchair for mobility in cases where there are no access ramps is considered disability.
Great. So thanks for offering some really good and concrete examples and for giving us a good, concrete explanation of a very complex topic.
Yeah, and as we go on, it'll get more complicated.
More and more complicated. Yeah. Great. Yeah. So speaking of complications, we're talking about theologies of disabilities. And it's interesting because it's all plural. So theologies with an S and disabilities with an S. Can you talk about why it's important that both of these terms be pluralized for our conversation topic tonight?
Yeah, I think, well, it goes back to the definitions we've already talked about a little bit, and maybe we could, have some conversation later with people about it. But theology is always contextual and related to particular circumstances, even though there may be similar beliefs. And so there is no one theology. There's theologies that fit contexts and places according to particular needs and relationships that define that place. And it fits with disabilities too, because there's no one disability. Disability is about differences, and bodies come with a range of abilities and limits and disabilities depending on the context. And so it's important to pluralize it from the start, because that avoids this kind of singular definitions, which can be very hurtful and exclusionary when speaking about the topic of disability. I can give an example too. Disability is not simply one thing. There are a range of disabilities that I've already given. My own journey with depression, for example, is often considered a disability, but there are varieties of experiences of depression. I can think of the autism spectrum too, which is a range of abilities and limitations that come with the autism diagnosis. And so recognizing from the start that disability is not one thing, and there's not one theology that addresses everything, is really important to building communities of mutuality and trust, accessibility together.
Mm. Right. So thanks again for the reminder that there's not just one theology, that there are many theologies. And in this range of theologies that are available, there's some times where theologies cause harm. Can you offer some examples, perhaps, of what kinds of harms have been done by theologies, and particularly around theologies of disability? So how has there been harm done in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I always say theology matters, and sometimes theology hurts, because often people are animated by their convictions. For example, I remember when I was starting to write my book on theology and disability, a particular person challenged me. She was a scholar of disability studies. She goes, "You're writing a book?" And she told about the experience of being brought up in a church and brought to the front of a church, and the congregation automatically, without asking permission, started to pray for her healing. And she felt very, very uncomfortable being placed in that position. And when the congregation finished, especially without asking her permission, and the cure didn't happen, she was blamed for it, for not having enough faith. And her experience in church caused her to leave church, and of course think that theology and disability don't go together at all as terms. And so I remember her relaying that story, and I wonder if we could have a raising hands experience here already in our conversation. Mm-hmm. How many of you here in this room together have experienced hurtful theologies related to disability? I think it's a common experience. I see hands going up. Mm-hmm. I can give another example. I gave the most extreme example to start out. But another example are people that talk to me, first of all, as if my son has no agency. So they ask me what he would like without asking him in certain contexts. And in another context, I was speaking in the church. One person came up to me and said, "Wow, that's such a gift that you have a son that can challenge you and help you grow spiritually," as if my son's sole purpose with his disability is to help my moral development. Those are very subtle examples, but also examples of how belief, in some sense of how God's active in the world, can actually be problematic and cause further harm for people with disabilities. Mm. Another example, I mean, we could talk all night about it.
No, please offer another example. Yes, please go ahead.
Well, an example with me and my journey with depression, I've heard it attributed that my own lack of faith is part of my struggle to find joy sometimes. So when the cause of a disability is seen as a lack of faith, which relates to my friend who wasn't cured and made a spectacle of in front of the church, those kinds of moral examples or attributions of blame reinscribe harm and re-victimize people who are already feeling on the margins of communities. So that's why I'm passionate. You're starting to get some of that come out about what I do and the importance of theologies of disabilities in faith communities.
Great. Thanks, Tom. This is a really important topic, and we saw how many among us have been personally touched and personally harmed by theologies of disabilities that were not helpful. Tom, I wonder if you can help us wrestle with some of the passages in the New Testament. So, you talked about your own journey and also your friend's journey where they were prayed for, you were prayed for, and then there was not healing and told that they didn't have enough faith. But in the New Testament, Jesus sometimes encountered people with disabilities, and, there was some prayer, and then sometimes there's a response, your faith has made you well. And so how do we reconcile that? What do we do with those passages? They come up regularly in the lectionary. So how do we understand healing in this broader context?
That's a centerpiece, because often people look to the New Testament stories of Jesus healing people and simply assume that disability is a flaw that needs a remedy. So even before starting to look at Scripture, it's important to recognize, too, But disability is a relational construct that is deemed a disability by a certain status quo. I call it normalcy, what counts as normal. So that disability becomes a site, a representation of flaw that needs a cure, that needs a remedy in order to be made whole. And what's interesting about how that often occurs, especially in modern societies, is that's made a problem of the individual rather than the society that sets up structures which are demeaning or exclusionary. And so often when people, say in the 21st century, read the healing narratives, they think it's all about the individual body who appears on the scene as a spectacle to be made an example of and healed as a moral lesson of how faith cures bodies. And I think once we start to recognize how the problem may not be the individual body, which fits into a certain way of conceiving disability, but rather the social scenario, which opens up the possibility to read the healing narratives in the New Testament a bit differently. For example, one of the famous examples that I like to use is John 9, where Jesus' disciples, they all come upon a person who was born blind, and Jesus' disciples ask Jesus, well, who sinned that this man may be born blind? Was it him or his parents? As if the attribution of fault was a kind of automatic. And Jesus' immediate reaction is none, but rather that the glory of God might be revealed. So Jesus uncouples, first of all, the link between personal fault or moral failure or lack of faith and disability. And second of all, opens out other possibilities of what's going on. And Jesus then, there is a healing in the narrative, but what's interesting about this narrative and so many others is it's not just a matter of a person being healed, but a restoration of community, because disability, especially in the New Testament, meant ostracizing, marginalization, much as it does now, but in the context of blindness and leprosy, mental health challenges, what we might understand to be demons in different ways. These are all marginal kinds of experiences where people were ostracized and excluded. And what scholars, theologians of disability are starting to suggest is it's about the community and the restoration to community less than it is about an individual body. And even more than that, it's about Jesus as the remaker of community together. Jesus opens up the glory of God by making and remaking what it means to be a community together. And I find that, healing in some ways, because it opens up beyond just people with bodies that happen to be flawed, to thinking about how the community might respond to the many different kinds of embodiments that human beings present in the world. And what's interesting, too, if you read scriptures totally, and I've marked a bunch of passages, we don't have to get into them all, but you think about different passages, you can imagine all the people with different ranges of disabilities and abilities that were never known. Jesus didn't cure all disabilities. Jesus' ministry isn't about curing, but rather about making community whole. And I think of shalom as an example of what it means to be in community and to flourish together in right relationships of different range of abilities. Paul had his thorn of the flesh. Moses had his stutter. Jacob had his limp. These things weren't cured or seen as a lack of faith, but in some cases were seen as actually testimonies of faith. And so rereading the scriptures and some of the narratives again really does open up possibilities. And we could talk a lot about this in more detail together, but I think that strikes at really the heart of the topic, because it's often those healing narratives that become the reference point for some of the more damaging practices in churches.
That's great. Thank you, Tom, for, again, another complicated nuance.
Yeah.
And Dan is offering an addition here. Loving your neighbor is acceptance without stigmatizing. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
So, Tom, in your response, you differentiated clearly between cure and healing. And I just wondered if you might give an example of what would be an example of a cure. You've talked about healing as being restoration of community, but can you help differentiate the two a little further?
Well, cure in disability studies is seen as a kind of four-letter word. But it's really important because there are different models of disability that are talked about. One model that's often talked about is the medical model, which treats disability as the problem of the individual body. Now, on the one hand, treatment, in some cases, people seek it out, and it can be very liberating for people. I know in my case with depression, treatment has meant liberation and functioning in ways that are life-giving for me. And so in some sense, it's really about the person's own agency and how their own voice and their own position in the world finds flourishing in communities. So there are more and more scholars of disability that don't necessarily want to denigrate medical advances, but it's really important to realize that society often does stigmatize bodies, and it does treat disability as a flaw that either needs to be contained, cured, and with the negative aspect of cure, that needs done away with. Disability should disappear from the scene altogether as somehow only a site of deficiency. But there are many people who talk about experiences of suffering, and I give the example of my own journey with depression, where medical help has been a life-giving thing for me. The other model is the social model of disability that you can already sort of see in some of the things that we've talked about. That is that it's the community that becomes disabling, the community that actually is problematic because it makes participation and co-creation of life together impossible for some kinds of bodies. So the social model would point out the ways that communities need transformation. And so that's how I was reading the healing narratives, a little more in light of the social model. And I still do use cure as a kind of scary word that I'd like to put in quotes like that, because when disability does appear on the scene, it's often first seen as a problem to be done away with. And I like to flip the script on that, because maybe the problem's in the community. Maybe the problem's in the representation of disability.
Right. Thank you for differentiating between the medical model and the social model. And in talking about healing, you talked a fair bit about the importance of restoration back to community, of making the community whole, of noting it's not about the individual, it's about how the community interacts. What do you think that might look like tangibly, the restoration back to community? What would that what would be an example in today's context of how that might appear?
Well, words that come to mind are access. Often words like inclusion, belonging, hospitality, welcome. These are all terms that speak to what it might mean to create community together. But those words have limitations as well. So when I think of community and I think of the kingdom of God, I like to use the kingdom, the family of God. Paul uses that in his letters as an example, the new household of God, a barrier-free place where exclusionary practices according to human ordinance are no longer, but the body of Christ is one. I think of that as a place of what I like to call deep access. But the difficulty with the term access is it's often seen by communities as a one-step process. We're an accessible community because we've done something with our building. But access is multiple and ranges from as many bodies that are in community. So the question is less about access as a one-time achievement and more about access as a pathway to participation for all and by all. Who's in the community? And questions that often come to mind that can be asked is who's there and who's where? Often leadership is represented only a thin variety of the bodies that are represented in a community. What does real deep access mean? And asking who's where can be one of those questions. Who's not there? Who counts for we, the scare quote we. Yep. So I think of access in the wide sense, and I like the term belonging more and more, because belonging is about each person's sense. You belong when you're missed when you're not there. You belong when you contribute to the leadership and are able to participate when you choose to do so. Those kinds of words resonate deeply with me. And you can see it goes beyond just welcome, which can be a one-time act. But what's welcome look like if a person's welcome, but then there are not pathways to participation there so that all can participate. The word accommodation is sometimes used too, but I like to think of accommodation as two-way and not simply something done for people with disabilities. So there's the danger of paternalism, of treating disability as something to be done to and people with disabilities to be given to rather than contribute. So I like to think of accommodation, but as a two-way process where oftentimes Chris accommodates me quite deeply in my misunderstandings. And so I'm riffing around these words, but when you think of community and what deep community might mean, I like terms like belonging, deep access. Inclusion is a good word too, but often inclusion can mean according to the terms of those in leadership only. And so it can be one of those things that people don't really challenge the status quo.
That's great, Tom.
I see a lot of people might.
Yes. No, thanks for engaging us in the conversation so far. And some questions are starting to emerge on the flip chart. So I wanted to encourage, if people have some questions, please feel free to write them in the flip chart paper. We'll bring those into the conversation. But Diane has a question for you, Tom. Diane is asking, why would we say it is restoring when the ones not able did nothing to break the relationship?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So restoration, it could be more like conciliation when the problem from the start is ableism and the community that renders it difficult. So that's a really good question. It's like some indigenous writers are saying, well, reconciliation may not be the right word. It may be conciliation that's needed when the relationship was never positive to begin with. And so restoring to community, that's a good challenge because it may mean actually the rethinking and reimagining in an expansive way what it means to be community.
Great. And Diane is agreeing that that is a good word. Wonderful. So are there other questions that people might have? Please feel free to write them in the flip chart paper, and you can write them at any time, but now is a particular moment to encourage people to ask questions based on what you've heard, or you may want to offer a comment, things that you that maybe resonated with you or things that you're wondering about. So please feel free to offer those in. So Nancy has a notation. Nancy thinks of it as restoring the community to wholeness. So along the lines of what you were saying, Tom, in terms of the community and not the individual. Nicely
put. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Diana is asking, is this to be shared to a wider audience? Diana, are you asking about the webinar, this webinar conversation? Yes. This webinar itself is being recorded. Christiane had noted that a little earlier. So yes, it will be shared with a wider audience. After the webinar ends, we'll post a link on the website, and we'll also share that link around. So anyone who would like to can access the website in this conversation. Or you yourselves, if you later think, oh, there was a really good response that Tom had offered, let me go back and look at it. You can view the recording later as well. So a few more people are noting some questions here. Maybe while those come up, I wonder if I could ask you another question, Tom. And then when these come up on the screen, we'll feed those in. So earlier you had talked a little bit about access. You started talking about access. I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about accessibility. So what does accessibility mean? And is it the same as, I know you've talked about inclusion and how that's not maybe an ideal word, but what is accessibility? And is accessibility the same as welcoming and inclusion?
Yeah, I think they're all interrelated. It's a really good question, and I don't think there's one answer. I think communities should be talking, and this is what I say often when I do workshops and so forth and speak with people, is accessibility is not a 5-step process. Accessibility is about the communities talking together about what it means to be together. Who's there, who's not there, and who's where. Who are we? What's the mission of who we are? And those kinds of questions open out what the particular needs might be, but also what the particular gifts might be. Often, it thinks of a needs assessment is done in churches, and the category of disabilities put into, something that needs to be used for our resources. But again, that's missing the whole point, that people have a range of abilities, and there are a range of gifts in the community as well. So rather than needs assessment, I think of an appreciative inquiry. Who's there? Who can contribute to the making of communities so that, again, access as a pathway to the participation of all, for all, and by each, that may look differently. So I think ramps, and not just in the back of buildings, but communicate to the wider community that this is a community that thinks about accessibility. But if you have a ramp in the front door, and yet not a ramp up to the lectern or the altar, that sends definite signs. Or if sermons are constantly using the example of blindness and deafness as an example of a lack of faith, and these are issues that creates an inaccessible community because people aren't able to access the most being together, but also God's love in the being together. And so I don't think of access as a 1 or a 5-step category, but rather an ongoing discussion in each community. Of course, there's the Accessibility for Ontario Act, that has procedures for public, for all buildings and codes. That's really important because it's a human rights issue. But access goes beyond just a human rights issue. It's a matter of belonging and being community together, especially in church.
Great. So Christiane is asking a question. So as you were talking, Tom, you noted the challenge of people associating with blindness with lack of faith. So Christiane is wondering, are there alternative metaphors for spiritual unwillingness to, quote, see? What might be some alternatives?
Well, often alternatives are used. I think of Paul's use of pride. There are examples of arrogance. I mean, there are examples of stubbornness, unwillingness. I think there are all kinds of substitute. I think it would be really great to get together and come up with a bunch of new metaphors for thinking about this. I'm just riffing right now, but I think of some of the New Testament metaphors that are out there already, rather than, and it's no accident that our bodies become the first use of metaphor. So we use our noses and our mouths and our ears and eyes and different parts of our bodies to speak metaphorically, but it's important to be creative, and I like to think of the expansive relational imagination as what I call it, but an imagination that thinks about what it means to be in relationship with one another in the most robust, mutual, reciprocal kind of way. And that means rethinking everything. That means intercultural, sharing power, intersectional way of being together.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Tom. And as you were speaking,
it's a kind of a non-answer. Sorry about that.
No, it's a good it's a good answer, and shares that we're still very much on a journey. And as you're talking, for many people added some comments on the flip chart. Christiane just noted maybe this is a new small group ministry to have these kind of dialogues. And then there were a couple of other questions. So one question was, is it an unwillingness or not being able to go beyond what people know or what they've already been told? That's the wondering.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's all of the above, and I'd be curious to hear more from the group on that. In my experience, especially in starting to be more open about my journey with depression and being an advocate and ally with my son Chris, I find that it's fear often. People not knowing what to do, and so referring to the status quo as a kind of automatic barrier, a block because of an unwillingness to be vulnerable and to admit not knowing and to be afraid instead of simply saying, what's going on? How can I be with you, Tom? Or, and I find this on a number of fronts related to intersectional issues, race and sexuality and gender, that fear gets in the way, the fear of being vulnerable together and recognizing the woundedness of our relationships and the harm done, but also the inherent possibilities of, I'm not going to use the word restore again, but building right relations together, what that would mean. And that's why I like the word vulnerability, because it's an openness to be human together in a way that risks failure. Some of my biggest failures with my son in the journey was when I thought I knew better and wasn't really willing to risk failure. And we need better theologies that speak of failure and risk in that way.
Excellent. And then there's been a few comments. So I wonder if I just might read the comments, and then you're welcome to comment on the comments. One from Jenny notes, Jenny likes the approach about deep access and appreciative inquiry. How might this fit in with the employment requirement to accommodate? So that's one question. A few others are comments. Maybe I'll just read those and we can go back to Jenny's question. So Nancy notes that it's an asset-based approach to community.
It is. Thank you.
Good. Shelley writes, Shelley thinks that people shut down when talking about brain injury and how fragile, although resilient, the brain is. And this is definitely fear-based.
Yeah.
And Susie talks about privilege, too. It's something that prevents us from appreciating barriers. And Susie has had many more experiences of access that Susie's getting used to getting in Susie's way and getting in and finding room. So those are several comments that were offered. In there was also a question. So I wonder if you might comment on some of what we've heard so far.
Yeah, I would affirm all those comments. Thank you. I'm having trouble focusing on the screen and then trying to look and engage directly. But I appreciate the comments, and I think I guess one thing about being vulnerable together is there's need for boundaries as well, and there's need for coming alongside of and advocation. So in recognizing that barriers exclude, sometimes barriers protect. So I think it's important to be nuanced in how we think about boundaries and vulnerability and barriers, because not all communities are safe in a way that the conversation can be real and honest, and injury can happen. So I realized, and I'm sort of riffing with some of the comments, that deserves mentioning as well. And setting up structures to support the kind of vulnerability we're talking about is key to building communities of deep access and deep belonging. And I wonder if some of the unwillingness and difficulty people have is related to the fact that so many disabilities are hidden and people have been shamed. So the notion of shame is, Brené Brown's written on shame and vulnerability before, and she's really helped me think about these things. Shame is really deep as well, and embarrassment. And that's why it's so important for me to own these things and for me to talk about them. Is I think the more we can talk about them together, the more willingness can be cultivated in our communities.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that wisdom. There's been a couple more comments, and then I wonder if we can go back to Jenny's question. So Diane's comment is, Diane's problem is that the business people take over and does things that are not acceptable to the church, and makes Diane go through a council and a board to have access to a chair that they can use, and that's limiting.
Yes.
Nancy also offers a comment that's not unwillingness so much as a lack of opportunity to interact, but likes to think that upcoming generations might be more open and demanding about diverse faith communities. And Nancy goes on to share that there is a generational difference in terms of our experience growing up with diverse populations.
Yeah.
So those are a couple of comments. One more for Diane. Diane just noted that the church has learned very well to accept some behaviors of some who cannot be as calm as most. So I wonder if we can just go back to Jenny's question. So Jenny had noted that Jenny likes the approach about deep access and appreciative inquiry. So how might this fit in with the employment requirement to, quote, accommodate?
Yeah. Accommodation's a huge word, and it's receiving some criticism by disability studies because, again, it's a one-way. But there are mandates that accommodation is made in communities to support people in communities. And so I think accommodation is part of what it means to make full participation possible. But often, and this goes back to another point made by the group, that sometimes it's the business model that gets in the way because we're about finances and resources. And I like to think of, rather than a kind of pyramid that moves from the top down, you've got decision makers who allocate resources for the people. I like to flip the script on that as well, to think about, well, it's the people that are there and represented, and the people are resources, and it's more than just monetary, and perhaps decisions can be made in a different kind of model where leadership is genuinely the co-creation of community. The business model is important, and I realize practical implications and structural processes and policies make community possible. But sometimes, at least in my experience in my own communities, they get in the way from real accommodation. But I think the issue of legal, the legal right to accommodation is big. And often, well, I can give you the example at the University of Toronto. It's really challenging how resources are allocated. So when I'm asked to comment on these things, I try to just say, well, who's the resource here, and who's doing the allocating? And it's really interesting because I'm interested in power sharing, but that's not the university model. And just even playing with those terms sometimes loosens and opens up possibilities for communities.
Yes, excellent. Jenny had a follow-up question and is wondering, does our law come from the medical model?
I think so. I think if you look at, even in terms of advocating with my son, so much of what counts for resources are in terms of, well, is the diagnosis serious enough? Does the diagnosis warrant it? Do the behaviors warrant it? And by behaviors, it's meant problems for fitting into social environments. So the whole system is set up based on the medical model to make the problem a matter of individual bodies who need to fit. So that disability becomes something, I like to use the word, that needs to be contained. Individual bodies have disabilities, and so there's a long way to go to transform the way that agencies think about it. But there are a lot of great agencies out there that I'm involved with who are resisting as much as possible, but also have to play by the system to get the resources. So it is a problem and a tricky thing to navigate.
Okay, great. Thank you for that response. Jenny also offers her thanks and notes that's very helpful. A couple more comments from Diane. Diane notes that the law has said that we are to be accessible to all for any place or any group that has many people coming to it. And Diane also notes that those who have been disabled and others have always been the ones who have accommodated society. Now we need to give their power back to level the playing field.
Yep. I think there's a long way to go in that, and I come back to theology because I think that theology can help inspire the imagination of people to think about recreating and co-creating community together. So I think that in this sense, theology can be an ally in the work of doing this for our faith communities.
Great. So speaking of theologies, at the very beginning you had reminded everyone that there are many different theologies, and some theologies of disabilities speak about a disabled God. What does that mean, and why might that be relevant?
That's a great question, and I was thinking of using the example of a disabled God in responding to one of the questions earlier. I would recommend a book by Nancy Iceland called The Disabled God, which is where this language comes from. But I also want to raise up Judith Snow, who is a disability activist in Toronto, who talked about God being a quadriplegic, and really all human beings being God's service providers, in the sense that God is a God in solidarity with humanity. And what we see, according to Nancy Iceland's book, is a God who doesn't necessarily come to humanity and change everything and make all differences in bodies and types disappear, but rather raises up differences to be community together. And in Iceland's book, she even talks about the resurrected body of Jesus not being cured, the wounds gone, but the wounds being retained to show that God doesn't do away with it, but takes it up into God's very being as a sign, as a signal of God's solidarity with humanity in all of its variety, and even the woundedness of wounds. So wounds aren't something to be erased, but taken up into God's very being. I find that incredibly comforting, especially in terms of depression, that it's not something to be overcome, but rather something that God embraces and holds close to God's own heart, taken up into God. So if we're serious about Emmanuel, Jesus being God with us in all the varieties of bodies and experiences, even the resurrected Christ retaining the wounds of God. And that has implications for how we envision life beyond death together, and what real community might mean. Some people ask if everything's going to be cured, if disability is done away with. And my answer is, well, it depends. Life with God is going to be rich and varied according to the different people's own understanding. I once heard a speaker with cerebral palsy saying, I hope that my pain is gone. But cerebral palsy is who I am as a person, and so I don't expect my body to be different than who I am and how I understand myself. The notion of a disabled God and Christ retaining the wounds open up these possibilities, especially to begin to reimagine what the life of faith is outside what I call normalcy and outside of some of the problematic theologies that lead to exclusionary behaviors. And so it opens up, it's exciting for me when I think of all the possibilities for imagining my own journey and for thinking about what it means to be community together, this kingdom of God that doesn't make everybody the same, but equal and different. Bodies are different. So what does it mean to be loved by God, created by God in differences, and to share that image of God together in community? I think each community is going to answer that differently, and each person will too. But that's, I'm getting all excited here. But the disabled God opens up all kinds of possibilities for thinking theologically in a way that can transform communities.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom, and thanks for sharing about that really important book by Nancy Iceland, The Disabled God. You started hinting a little bit about this in your response about what happens in the afterlife, about resurrection. So, and our Christian hope is often connected to the afterlife and to think about resurrected bodies. So can you talk a little bit more about what you think this means for people with disabilities and mental health challenges? Do you think that bodies are restored or healing? You talked a little bit about your friend with cerebral palsy, but I wonder if you can expand on that just a little bit more in terms of what, in terms of hope and resurrection and the afterlife.
Well, it's one of those topics that, along with the healing narratives, comes up over and over again. Will disability be healed in the afterlife? And I revert to the way that we think about the healing narratives. What is Jesus' ministry about? Gives us a glimpse of the reign of God, the kingdom of God that is yet to come. Deep shalom, I use the word deep just to kind of, put some real heft to the language of what shalom, peace, a capacious, widespread being together in a way that the flourishing of all in God happens beyond and ways beyond our imagination. So I think of the afterlife in those terms. There was a theologian in the early church that talked about the never-ending growth into God, which is eternal. Life with God is never-ending, and it means transformation that will be different, I think, for each person in how they understand their own flourishing and their own journey with God. That's how I think of this. There are varieties of responses, but that's how I think of it. It depends on the voice of the person and what their own sense of flourishing in God and life together might mean in that. For some, it means a restoration in terms of what we might think of cure. For others, it means deep communion with others in the life of God, and that's how I like to think of it in that latter sense.
That's great. Thank you, Tom, for your responses. As we were talking, a few more people were writing on the flip chart paper, and Shelley, for example, wondered, could God be brain injured? And also wondered about an autistic God. I don't know if you want, would you like to offer a response to that?
A capitalized Y, capital E, capital S. I would say that all of those things, I think, if God identifies with humanity in love, and that love is incarnational in a deep way, I think all those things can be said of God. And there are multiple stories in scriptures that testify to this. I think of, there's a new book that I haven't seen, God in the Psych Ward, a God who's depressed, a God who struggles with mental health challenges, a God who lives with brain injury. I mean, what's interesting about this is it allows the multiplicity of the voices that of people who find themselves loved by God, talking about what it means to be living in God's presence among others. And so I think the metaphors for God and God's relation of love with humanity and the world are open for multiple metaphors. And so that's where this expansive relational imagination comes in theologically.
Great, thank you. A couple more comments have also come in. So Nancy notes a huge shift in their spiritual growth came when Nancy shifted to seeing God as being powerless. And this is where divinity lies. Nancy goes on to say, in powerlessness and what that allows us to create or co-create. Diane notes, Diane does not identify themselves with what they don't have, but with the love of spirit within them, and that is a gift.
That's beautiful.
Lovely, thank you. And Christiane notes that our hymnody makes it very difficult to find language that does not perpetuate doctrines of omnipotence. So, for example, Christiane appreciates bring many names, but beyond that, it can be tricky. And William Bill offered a follow-up comment that there's a need for new liturgical resources. So do you want to speak a little bit about that around our hymn, availability of hymn resources and liturgical resources?
Are there any hymn writers among us? I think that's exactly right. Let's commit to this work together, because I think the hymns, there are a lot of, well, as we know, triumphalist hymns that can be problematic and colonial. There are hymns that reinscribe the kinds of disabling theologies that we're naming here together. And so I would affirm that criticism and recognize the need for rethinking our language so that it becomes empowering for the multiple kinds of bodies that do inhabit our communities of faith. And I love the idea of a powerless God. And I want to raise up a number of different theologians who wrestle with this. Some think that only a powerful God can dismantle the structures of oppression and be in solidarity. And others say it's a powerless God who's able to identify with my own vulnerability and our vulnerability as human. So there's real robust conversation on this. But in my own work, I like to speak of a vulnerable God who risks pain, who risks engaging creation, and experiences the pain and fracturing of the human community and the bodies that do suffer, so that God then takes up that pain and offers opportunities and invites possibilities for healing and deep communion together. And I like the idea that God, and the idea of kenosis, which is a theological term for self-emptying in the Philippians passage, can be helpful there, that God doesn't see power to be something to be held onto and grasped, but empties. So for the other, for the finite creature. So I find a lot of power in powerlessness and what that means, though I recognize that different people and there are different conversations that happen around that. So thank you.
That's great. And Tom, you may be pleased to know that in response to your question of are there any hymn writers out there, we have a couple volunteers. So Diane shared that Bill is a hymn writer, and Bill shared that Diane is a hymn writer. So so there's at
and
least
I happen to be a
among us.
musician.
Oh, amazing!
I would be delighted to write some music to some of these things, and I know some musicians. Let's do this.
So that would be amazing if we could create some new hymns that speak about theologies of disabilities in a helpful and healthy way. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
a few more
that's
comments
wonderful.
that have.
Thank you.
So that's good. So we're going to remember this. So a few more comments that have been offered. Susie notes that there's someone in their congregation who sits by choice for the gospel and for the hymns, as a simple way to challenge that standing is equal to respect.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And, you know, we've got to find their language, because often ministers say, please stand if you're able. That language doesn't work. Or rise in mind and spirit. That language doesn't really work either, because it still attributes rising in the spirit as a good, as opposed to remaining seated. And so all these kinds of things. I'm happy to hear that. I think I like to think of there's provocateurs and disability as a provocation that's an invocation, actually, for our communities to be more robust in their inclusive practice. So
great.
Thank you.
So what would you offer, Tom, if you were leading worship in a congregation and the congregation's used to standing for a hymn? What might you offer instead that is not, you know, rise in body or spirit, or what would you offer?
Let's sing this song together. I've done this, and I simply leave out that. And, you know, it's really interesting that a lot of people remain seated. Like I deal with chronic back pain, and frankly, it's easier for me to sing and remain seated. And other people find that they sing better, and it's really interesting if we name that people find vitalizing singing happening in a variety of ways. Some people like to move and dance and sway. Some like to remain meditative, just to even name that. But I haven't found another terminology, so whenever I lead in a worship setting, I don't say anything. And I find that people find the freedom to do what's most comfortable for them in the worshipful environment. But there may be wisdom in the room that I would invite to please contribute. Will all these comments and questions also be recorded?
What we are speaking is being recorded, but the flip chart paper will not be kept. So as we're speaking them
just
back,
to offer some wisdom there, I'll step in for a sec.
Thank you, Christiane.
So in terms of confidentiality and freedom to express yourself freely on the flip chart, we don't broadcast that. We will broadcast the recording. We're not using last names or anything like that, and nobody knows the attendees. It's important to protect people's privacy, because we don't have a formal boundary setting with these webinars, so we do that. So the recording is available.
I apologize,
Yeah, the recording will be available to everybody who signed up here. The flip chart and evaluative pieces at the end are just to the presenters and the hosts and United in Learning. And then we can use those as tools. But I have a feeling that Tom's not going to let a lot of these comments go, nor will Adele. So the flip chart is just... Now, when you broadcast, will there be closed captioning? And this is something I want to point out where we are really struggling with in United in Learning to know how best to share technology and learning opportunities when there are a variety of ways of learning. Even as simple as someone who described themselves as hearing impaired said, Christiana, please don't cover your face at all when you do this, because I lip read. That was very interesting. I have a habit of doing this. So, little things like that. Any suggestions to make a better opportunity for everyone to participate would be great. If you have ideas, please include that in the evaluations. And I think that's enough from your friendly local tech support person. And over to you, Adele and Tom. I'll be coming back on in about 15-20 minutes to invite you into an evaluation process. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much
for that.
Sorry for that. But these comments and questions are really great. So I want to just do a shout out to everybody in the room. So thank you.
Absolutely. So thanks everyone for your comments. Tom, there's been a few more comments in response to the hymns. Hymns has really generated some good conversation. So Bill is excited to take on hymn writing. And then we've had a couple suggestions of actually some hymns that people think work well. So Miriam noted Made in God's Image. And Liz has suggested More Voices 136, When Hands Reach Out and Fingers Trace. That's an excellent choice.
Yeah.
So those are two for consideration.
Yeah, good. Yeah, not all hymns are equally problematic. In fact, there's some, I don't mean to disparage the entire hymnal opportunity, but a lot can be really difficult.
Okay, very good. Good.
One thing I wonder too, sorry, Adele, were you going to ask something?
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
I think one of the things that inhibits the robust conversations together is the lack of ability to lament together about failures and problems. And so I always appreciate lament hymns that open up communities to think about what it means to be out of right relation. And not simply, and the education that can go around lament too, that disability is not something to be lamented in and of itself, because often disability and mental health challenges are seen as lamentable. And I think education can happen around this to open up a greater, and I'll use the word deep again, deeper sense of what lament is.
Great. I think we have another question about hymns. How do we avoid the hymns that make God or the Spirit's love conditional?
Yeah, not sing them, but it is there, and there's so much, even in Scripture, that needs to be, I think, read against itself. I like to think about reading the Bible against itself, because there are a lot of problematic texts, some of which we've mentioned, that can be read in ways, and thinking about other texts that open out alternative readings of texts. So conditional love, that make God's love conditional. That's a problem that can lead to the very disabling theologies we're talking about, that somehow a disability is a moral failure, or depression is a moral failure, a spiritual failure. And the list goes on. And so I think focusing on hymns that open up those possibilities. And I remember at one point in one community of faith, we actually talked about the meaning of hymns and had a discussion about language in the hymn that some people found problematic. So I wonder about hymn study groups. I mean, we have Bible study groups, hymn study groups that begin to name some of these things and open out maybe alternative possibilities for how congregations themselves may even rewrite certain verses or offer alternative words that are possibilities there.
Great.
Thinking along with you.
Perfect. Thank you. So there's a word of thanks for reminding us and reinforcing the sense of the many facets and faces of God. So a word of thanks for that. So Tom, a different question for you. So earlier you talked a bit about your journey with depression, and I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about how does mental health connect into this whole conversation that we're having around theologies of disabilities?
Yeah, I think it's new and emerging, and there's disagreement about whether mental health should be in the disability studies. I put it there because I find mental health challenges are as much stigmatized as a range of visible and invisible disabilities. And I think of, in some cases, mental health challenges become visible disabilities in our relationships. And so I think it belongs in the conversation because it means creating, again, communities with deeper accessibility, with a range of different two-way accommodations. I'll use that qualifier where people with mental health challenges can be also resources for the community, just as I can be a resource for helping a community rethink its language about joy in faith. I think accommodations two ways, like Chris has helped me and has had to accommodate me. And so I think mental health belongs in those conversations, and I think it's an ongoing journey that's becoming more and more included in disability studies because of the social model and the range of exclusions that people with mental health challenges face on a daily basis, and the diverse responses. There's now what's called MAD studies, in the way CRIP studies sort of inverses and uses what has been a derogatory term, crippled, to now be an empowering term for communities to assert their agency. MAD studies is doing the same thing for people with mental health challenges, and I affirm some of that, and it goes beyond just human rights. It goes into what it means to be a community of belonging, especially in the church, which should be the most radical community of belonging out there. I think that mental health discussions do belong in these conversations.
Wonderful, thank you. So I wanted to encourage everyone, we only have a few more minutes left in the webinar, so if you have some additional questions that you have not yet asked, now would be the ideal time to note those into the flip chart so that Tom can respond to those before we need to bring the webinar to an end. So please feel free to write additional questions and comments. In the meantime, there have been a few comments.
I see. Yeah. Go ahead,
Nancy notes. Oh no, that's great. Thanks. So Nancy notes that there's a MAD Arts Falls by their request under the disability umbrella for Canada Council and the Ontario Arts Council. So, so there's another example of reclaiming. Shelley shares that whether it's mental health or brain injury, including stroke, it's a physical problem in an organ in the body. So it's all brain issues. And Diane writes about what about the elderly as we are getting older. Never say old because they are going to become differently abled. So just a few comments there. Would you like to respond to any of those, Tom?
Sure. Thank you for these comments. I think one of the rallying cries of disability studies often is for those who are temporarily able-bodied, because in a certain sense, disability affects every human being. With age and dying and dementia now and becoming old. And so I think these conversations are really important because it opens up reimagining what it means to be human, what it means to be limited and fallible in ways that involve the brain. And so related to the comment about brain injury and everything involving the brain, yes. The only caveat that a lot of writers speak the danger of treating brain as a neurological, so it's only medically treatable.
Sorry, Tom, I think your sound, Tom, are you hearing me? I think that your sound may have disappeared. Christiane, are you able to help us out with Tom's sound to help us ensure that we're hearing him again well? Oh, see. Tom, can you say a few more words and see if your sound is back? We lost you partway through the comments. No, we still can't hear you, unfortunately. Tom, can you hear me?
Hello? Am I back?
Welcome back. Oh, thank you. You're
My
back
apologies.
now.
For some reason, I got cut off. My apologies, everybody.
No, that's okay. We're glad you're back and glad all is well. So we lost you partway through that response.
Yeah, my apologies. I
okay.
appreciate the idea of the importance of the human brain, but a lot of mental health writers and disability writers want to avoid reducing everything to the brain at the same time. So it's a kind of delicate balance to honor that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Liz offered a comment here. The meeting of social ableism with social ageism is a very serious issue in our society.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. And then Shelley has noted we need a more inclusive neurotheology that's not medically based.
Nice. Yeah. There are more and more, and especially as mental health becomes written, theologically rather, there's theological literature on mental health. Some of that's starting to come out, and I'd be happy to share a bibliography that I'm putting together that's growing if people on the email list would like to receive that.
That would be great, Tom. We can share that perhaps as a link when we send out the link to the recording of this webinar. And I think that segues well to a question that Emily is asking. Emily is wondering if you or we can suggest a resource or study guide to introduce this subject with faith communities. So I wonder if you can start, Tom, and then I might add a few things afterwards.
Well,
Actually, just before you start, Tom, just quick show of hands if you would like Tom to compile a reading list that we send out. Let's see what people think.
Yep,
we're getting a really strong response, Tom. And that's, okay, so we'll make that a part of what we send out.
And there are those in the room, too, that I think could offer lists, too. And so if I'll send one out, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in the room here, too, that I wonder if there's a way to contribute to each other.
There certainly is. One of the easiest ways is on the evaluation forms that we're going to be moving to in about 5 minutes, maybe 8 minutes. There'll be a chance for you to make suggestions and so on, and those evaluations are shared again with Tom and Adele, so they could be added to your bibliography, Tom. Okay?
Great. Thank you all.
So just a comment, and then maybe we can give some concrete responses to Emily's question. So Diane just notes that a question to Bill, that MILK is the Manitou Intentional Learning Community, so that, and the new Region 6 might do something on this on a wider basis. So that's an idea that the region might pick up. So going back to Emily's question, Emily is wondering about suggestions, resources, study guides to introduce this with faith communities. So Tom, did you want to offer some ideas? And then I can also offer some afterwards.
Well, there's a document that was brought forward to General Council that I think is available online for the United Church. And there is an educational resource that we've been working on and have yet to finish up, but I can say that it might be something that we could work on together to finish up. There are study guides. Open Doors is another resource that has a great, like a disability audit for communities to begin thinking about who they are and what accessibility and accommodation and belonging might mean. It's a great set of resources that is there. And then, of course, there are short books out there. The Christian Reformed Church has a great disability guide that I don't know if it's online or not. Do you know, Adele?
The Christian Reformed Church?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but I wonder if Miriam might know.
Miriam is
I
didn't want to put you on the spot,
Miriam.
You can wave your hand, Miriam, if to...
Miriam is typing her response, so we'll just wait for that to come up. In the meantime, I wonder if I can offer some additional. So Bill has noted, and Tom has noticed too, there is a report on theologies of disabilities. So that was that's been approved, and we can send out the link to that. There's also a very short video that talks about it, so we can send that out as well. There's also an accessibility audit on the United Church's website that's newly developed and available for, it's designed for communities of faith, so we can send out the link to that. And then every year we produce new worship resources for the International Day for persons with disabilities, which is on December 3rd, so beginning of Advent. And so there's already new resources on the website, and that can be a good opportunity to introduce the subject in a worship setting. So there's sermon ideas there, there's prayers, there's lots of ways of engaging it. And then generally on the website, on our United Church's website, there are some ideas and resources there about how we can start to introduce the subject and start to engage. So, so those are some ways that we can delve into the topic a little bit more.
I really want to also appreciate you, Adele, for all the work that you do to make this an important issue that's ongoing in the church. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. Thank you. So Miriam has written a response to the earlier question about the resource from the Christian Reformed Church and the Inclusion Handbook. Miriam believes it is hard copy only, so it's not available online. Yeah. So Emily offers thanks for the resources shared, and again, we'll offer those links when we send out the follow-up email after this webinar. And Diane just notes that using the fact that we have hearing aid devices is a good start for looking at how we have different needs.
It is a really good... Sorry, Adele, I interrupted you.
No, please, go ahead.
I was going to say that the hearing assistant devices are a really good way to start because often that gets unnoticed in communities. The range of different accommodations that can be offered and received in a community is interesting. I once spoke in a church that had celebrated its ramp, but people couldn't hear me because there were no hearing assistant devices, a number of people. So it's really interesting. It's part of the question, who's there and who's where?
Right. Very good. So we have another comment coming up, but in the meantime, Tom, I wondered if there might be some just a last comment or any words of wisdom or anything else that you wanted to offer as we move to close up the webinar.
Me or from?
From you.
From me. Okay.
So sorry. Here's. Sorry, just before you do that, Susie's question has come up, so maybe I'll read that, and then you can think about that as you respond as well. So Susie's question is, Susie would love to hear some more analysis across issues for a future time. So, for example, the resonance of institutional experience in residential schools. You don't have to address that now. This is for a future conversation, so we can parking lot that. So just as we start to go to the evaluation, Miriam has noted a website there, a website link there. We can include that. So any last thoughts? And then we'll invite Christiane to write it on to introduce the evaluation.
Yeah, the one, I guess, thing I think about is these are so important. These are such important conversations to have and in our communities, and to be willing to risk the messiness and discomfort that may be provoked as a result of having some of these conversations. And risking that together can be a really community building experience. But it can also be hard. And so I just want to offer encouragement in that. In my experience, cultivating some of these conversations, sometimes when I do workshops, it can be hard as people recognize the exclusion that's already there in their own community and get frustrated with it. But I think that's what it means to build communities of deep belonging and access together, is to have these conversations. And so just I guess a word of encouragement to risk having these conversations.
Excellent. Tom,
goes back to that theme of vulnerability and risk, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Tom, thank you so much for this conversation and for engaging us all in this really rich conversation about theologies of disabilities, for sharing some of your personal journey, for sharing your many insights. This is very much appreciated, and I think everybody learned a great deal in this time. So thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate the chance to learn with you and talk together. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. With that, I wonder, can we turn it back over to Christiane to introduce the evaluation process?
Yeah, sure. But I can also say on behalf of United in Learning and those of us who are serving in communities of faith, it is so often very difficult to have collegial discussions or this kind of thoughtful engagement around an idea. It's like once we left school, that the emerging theologies and are often not as accessible. We don't have the tomes that we read and discuss in class and have a chance to exchange ideas. So thank you very much for providing this forum around theologies. I know that just personally, as someone who graduated over 20 years ago, as much as I try to stay current, the ideas that are emerging and becoming mainstream theologies is very encouraging and sounds very different from some of the courses that I took in the 90s. So thank you for that. Thank you, both of you, for your incredible, warm, engaging personalities and making it easy for the rest of us to be part of this. There are...
Thank you.
Namaste. Adele, are there other webinars coming up around the disabilities in the church?
Well, thank you for mentioning that, Christiane. There actually are. This is the second webinar in a series. The first one was held last month. It was on Let's Talk About Diversity and Disability, also an engaging conversation, and that link is also available. This is the second one. The next one will be offered in January, so nothing in December, but the next one in January will be offered by Miriam Spies, who's going to be talking about youth ministries. So that will also be a wonderful, engaging time. And then after that, there are two more that are coming up. So the next one is on Tuesday, January the 8th, so you can mark your calendars if you're able to attend, and that will be a wonderful time with Miriam to engage that conversation.
Wonderful. So you can see that, being human, Nancy, I think that should be required reading for anyone who ever engages with another human being. It's such a fabulous...
It's on my list, yep.
Such a fabulous little book, and again, a huge insight on how to read the story of the Good Samaritan. I love that sort of thing. These are great, great evaluations. We also are looking at what might you like to have. Okay, so evaluation doesn't really mention that, but for future consideration, I mean, for me, I would love to go through another one of these because I think so much we just grazed the surface and we haven't even talked about the power of naming that I think is a huge thing in this whole area, and whether or not it's okay to use the term challenged as a euphemism for a disability. I find all of that very interesting. So I think there's lots more. If there's anything, we got the one comment earlier from Susie about the resonance of institutional experience residential schools. If you could cut and paste that one or copy and paste that one right into one of these, that'd be great, Susie. Adele, Tom, we're just about at closing, so you guys get last words. I'll leave the screen up for evals a few more minutes.
I'll just offer another word of thanks and an encouragement to sign up for additional webinars. And please, once the link is available, feel free to share that with others and particularly to share the learning. So if you learned something new or gathered some new insights, please engage others in your communities of faith to continue this conversation. And as was noted, this is one in the series, so in some ways this is one part of a much broader conversation. So the encouragement is always to keep talking, keep learning, keep engaging, and to continue to deepen our knowledge and engagement on these issues.
Yeah, talking together is a transformative thing. I mean, it's not just, it is itself a practice. And so I really appreciate these. So thank you, Adele and Christiane, for hosting these. And I think the fact that people are here, this is transformative work, and I'll be a part of the other ones.
Indeed. And thank you all for spending your evening with us. So much appreciated.
Okay, so there's a few of you still online. Adele and Tom and I are now going to disconnect the phone. I'm going to end the recording. I'll leave the flip chart up a bit before I close out the room. So wonderful evening, and thank you all so much, and blessings on the work you undertake. Good night.
Blessings to you all.